which is the first time that's happened. I've had confirmation just today that it was due to be published tomorrow, but now won't be. Probably a delay of 2 weeks, but that's not confirmed. So what's going to follow is, thanks to those of you who are leaving. That's absolutely fine. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Okay, so what I'm going to take you all through, I'm just going to make sure I can see you at the same time. I'll take questions throughout the presentation, so ask when you have one. But I'm going to start by talking first and foremost about the principles of the University Guide, why we do what we do, what we're aimed at doing, and quickly talk through about the overview of our methodology. Now, I did a similar session to this last year. I'm aware that some of the audience will be the same, so I'm going to be sort of skipping through that bit quite fast, just to make sure that everyone has a rough idea what I'm talking about. At that point, I'm going to concentrate a bit more on why things had to change this year, what else was different, and I'm then going to focus quite a bit of time on the subject changes we've made this year, because that's been the major thing that's been different. We've had 54 subjects for the last 8 years or so. We very rarely change our subjects, but this year we gave a full review to all the subjects that we provide rankings for, and resulted in 66 subjects. I might pause at some points to try and offer some reflections on the last session from Paul Ashburn, but that's going to be a bit impromptu, so you'll have to bear with me. Moving into the principles, we are aimed at prospective undergraduates. That's explicit in what the Guardian want. It affects our entire approach. This isn't about overall institutional prestige. This is about being a guide for prospective undergraduates, especially from those from a background where HE in the UK is not familiar. So by that I mean they might not have, they might be in the UK but not have a family member who's ever been to university before and can offer advice on where's good, what they should be looking for. It's also for students outside the UK to whom they want to see an overview of the sector as a whole, and perhaps don't have the same knowledge of what the local university is like versus the other one their friends go to if they've got good grades, or those sorts of latent understandings of higher education that you might get if you're a student in the UK who already has friends, a lot of whom go to university. We want to get to these students at the point in their decision making where they're long listing their options for further investigation. We don't want them to base their entire decision on the University Guide. We want them to kind of have a look, isolate the subjects that they're interested in, see who looks like they're pretty good at it, maybe go and visit those institutions, and then take the rest of the decision according to the knowledge that they acquire through their own journey. And we start with the assumption that they already know which subjects interest them. So there is a sort of use case for the guide where someone's thinking, I want to go to university, I wonder who's good, I'll see what subjects they do. But generally we assume it's the other way around. Students know what subjects they're interested in, they browse those subjects individually, and they find the departments that offer them. So with these principles, there are some methodological implications. First of which is, as I just said, the subject rankings are the primary product of the guide. Yes, the headlines tomorrow in 2 weeks will be about who's top and what they did to get there and how marvelous they are. But that probably is the commercial arm speaking. That, you know, those are the headlines that come from the University Guide, and that's one of the main reasons we produce an overall institutional ranking. That the main thing that we're trying to give to prospective students are the subject rankings. They pertain to undergraduates as much as possible, and we don't include research metrics. Research can benefit students being in a research-intensive institution, but we would expect that to manifest through the other metrics that we do use. Paul referenced earlier, lower student-staff ratios. They're associated with a research-intensive institution and a more prestigious institution by some ways of looking at it, higher expenditure as well. But we would expect those to be factors that will benefit in the undergraduate experience. Just being in a research intensive environment itself isn't what we're trying to convey as a positive undergraduate experience. We try to cover every stage of the student life cycle within our metrics. Yes, they are all approximations, but we try to cover all the different stages. And we try to lead students to the courses on offer within each subject area. So once they use our guide to find a university providing a subject that they're interested in and it meets the other criteria that are peculiar to the student, where it is, what grades they require, and so on, we then show them what courses that student, that department is advertising within that. There are then some pragmatic approaches to methodology. Just a bit about wording. Throughout this, you're going to hear me refer to each instance of a provider being active in a subject as a department. They might not call themselves a department. They might be part of a smaller school or a faculty or whatever. I'm just going to call them department. Because of our subject approach, the size of departments matters so much more to us than it does to the other domestic rankings. The other domestic rankings lead with their overall institutional rankings, and then their side project is the subject rankings. They can offer subject rankings for very small subjects like Celtic studies, for example, and it doesn't matter to their institutional rankings. If we try to do that, we would encounter very small levels of provision, and that would have a knock-on implication to our institutional rankings, and probably would, because we need the full range of metrics at a subject level, it would lead to a very patchy and incomplete representation of a student's options at that subject level. So we have to make sure that departments are large enough and that the subjects that we classify are also large enough to provide meaningful metrics. In order to produce a ranking, a fair comparability between departments is absolutely key. So this is the reason that we isolate full-time first degree provision whenever possible. It's not ideal, it's not good that as a university guide we're deliberately excluding part-time options, sub-degree options, but the second you start looking beyond full-time first degree, you run into questions of not comparing like with like and presenting a distorted view of where the suitable options are. Here's an interesting one. I'm not sure I've expressed it very well. Sorry about my phone. Where a factor is the key determinant of performance in a metric, we try to eliminate its effect. The example here is value-added scores. We know that the entry grades, the entry qualifications a student entered with are a stronger determinant of performance than which institution they go to. So just reducing some measure on final degree classifications would basically be restating the entry standards metric that we already have. We don't want to duplicate the effect, so we eliminate that. This is something I think I'll come back to later. We can do this because our primary objective is informing student choice. The TEF had a big dilemma on this sort of statistical consideration because they were trying to do three things with the initial TEF at least. The initial TEF was to inform student choice, but it was also to provide a view of quality for institutions to address their own quality and improve and drive enhancement activities. And it was also to work as a tool of governance to provide a view of overall performance of an institution. If you're trying to do all those three things, then this question of benchmarking and setting different expectations for different departments and different activities becomes very thorny. So we can usually afford to avoid that because our mission is so clear and so focused on student choice. But if we were trying to also measure quality, and it's only a subtle difference, but if that was part of our remit, then we would probably have to benchmark every metric. So it's one that we can talk about a bit later. So our methodology overview, as I said, we try to, you'll recognise this slide from last year, I didn't change it. We try to cover every stage of the student life cycle. So students enter with their entry standards. We have the average UCAS tariff. That's an approximation of how it's on the basis that learning alongside smart peers will boost one's own learning. There's another justification for using it, which is based on the dynamics of the higher education system, in which tariff scores can be seen as a kind of currency. The most attractive departments therefore become more valuable as more currency is spent on them. This is the justification that receives a lot of criticism because of its potential to become self-fulfilling, because of the adverse incentives it poses for elite institutions to widen participation. So we view it in a more simple format. Learning alongside other people with good entry qualifications will be a boost to one's own prospects of succeeding. Students want to encounter good staffing levels, so we have a student staff ratio. They want to have facilities dedicated to them that benefit their learning, so we measure expenditure per student. We want students to complete their degree and receive plenty of support. There's a lot institutions can do here. So we have this continuation index, again, looking at a level of expectation for each individual and seeing the extent to which institutions exceed that. We have 3 measures of teaching quality that are drawn from the National Student Survey. And we also want to look at student success. Now, this is probably the metric that gets most criticism because, yes, any measure of student achievement will provide a perverse incentive for institutions to inflate their grades. Again, as our position, or as a publication with a mission to inform student choice, we can kind of ignore the institution's responses to that. We're not the OFS, we're not the funding council. We don't have an overall mission to enhance the health of the higher education system. We're simply saying students who want to go to university want to be assured that they'll be supported to succeed. And therefore, the extent to which a university helps them exceed expectations is a good thing and something we should measure. The funding council wouldn't do this, the OFS wouldn't do this. And then, of course, life after university, we seek to approximate through the career prospects measure the extent to which students move on to what are judged to be positive graduate outcomes 15 months after graduation. These are all weighted differently. They all come together through a process to produce a subject ranking, and an institution's performance in the various subject rankings leads to the overall institutional rankings. So this is what a subject table might look like. That's a bad example because that's a main table. Pretend this was a subject table. You'd have the NSS results for each institution. They come from the NSS. Then we have 2 measures that are based on their input measures. They're based on cost centres, and then we have these that are based on the HEIR classification of subjects. So how we map the NSS results, no one's asked this, so I'll whiz through it, but it's quite a complicated one to handle because the NSS results come out aggregated by these CAR subjects. We know what HEIR codes belong to each CAR code. Sorry if this is crazy speak for most of you, but I'll go through it quickly. I'll take questions about it if you're interested in. We also order data that says what is the NSS study population, not response population, by HEIR code. So we might know that there was 110 students taking international relations who were eligible to complete the National Student Survey, and we know what guardian subject group each HEIR code belongs to. That's the part of the mapping that's so important to what we do. So with these three, we can combine them with the HEIR to CAR mapping to produce HEIR level NSS results that are weighted by the population. Then we can combine these HEIR level results with the HEIR to guardian subject group mapping to get our NSS results to guardian subject group level. It's quite a complicated process, but it's been working for several years. It was not affected really by the subject changes. We didn't have to order data differently this year because of the subject changes. We just controlled it through this element. I'll pause on the next one. There are two measures that are based on cost centres. Both of these, both cost centre based ones rely on a guardian subject group to cost centre mapping, which means that we've got now 66 subjects, but there are only 45 cost centres. So of course it's inevitable that some cost centres are used in more than one subject. An example would be creative art and design. It's a big cost centre. Students are taking modules that are classified as art and design, and that cost centre is generally connected to a whole range of different subjects. So we've got interior design, graphic design, fine art, fashion and textiles. We've got subjects for all of those. They're all referring to the resources that are in the broader cost centre of art and design. So to take the question that's come up in the chat, what that would look like is every student who takes a module has that module coded to one or more cost centres. It doesn't matter what subject the student's taken, and believe me, there are some odd combinations. If they're taking a module that's coded to art and design, the STU load associated with that module, the total FTE that they're taking, that becomes part of the numerator of the student staff ratio. If they're in a partner institution, it gets eliminated. So it's what's actually being delivered by the institution that counts here. Also, if they're on some sort of placement, the extent to which they're counted gets reduced. Then the denominator for the ratio is the volume of staff who are delivering that subject. So staff FTEs are isolated to those who have teaching or teaching and research in their academic employment function. And then we further look at what their contract says about the cost centre they belong to. Again, it can be split three ways, but let's keep it simple. If a staff member is part-time, they do 3 days a week, and they're delivering art and design, they would be a 0.6 in the denominator of the student to staff ratio, and that's how we build that. So we also use, most of our metrics depend on a HEIR to guardian subject group mapping. Now, HEIR is a relatively new classification. It was introduced for the first time in 2019-20. It replaced the old JAX codes, and it's a finer grain metric that doesn't have aggregation built into it. It's not metric, sorry, that was the wrong word, classification. It's basically that the introduction of HEIR codes is what prompted us to look at the subjects we produce rankings for. So those all come together as individual metrics. What we do next is we standardize each one. So, you know, if you've got a student staff ratio of 10 and the mean is 2 and the standard the mean is 12 and the standard deviation is 2, you'd be 1 standard deviation better than the mean, and we'd be taking that one value, we'd be weighting it by how important we say student staff ratios are, and then we total that across all the other metrics, each standardized and weighted in the same way, to produce a weighted standardized score, which we then rescale so that the top institution gets 100. And that's how we produce the rankings in a nutshell. We then look more broadly to produce institutional rankings so that the performance at subject level of each department is weighted by the full-time first degree volume of students taking that subject and the number of providers offering the subject in order to produce an overall score by which institutions are ranked. So that's a very positive version of what we do. Is that question coming through or someone on a different call? Okay, so that's the methodology overview. I'm happy to pause there and answer any questions if people have them about methodology, but otherwise I'm going to move on to why we did things differently this year. So why change this winning formula? Well, firstly, it's 8 years since the last major review of subjects. All have a hand up. Fenwick.
Yeah, thanks very much. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
Yeah, just to clarify a couple of points with regards to the methodology. So can you let me know which academic year or year's worth of data are being used for each indicator this year?
Yep, sure. Okay, so the 3 NSS ones are referring to both the 2022 survey and the 2021 survey aggregated across years, and they're truly aggregated, i.e., you know, it doesn't matter how many students you had in the 2 different years, we're counting them all collectively. Because of the subject changes, that's not always been the case. That's been done a bit differently. Student staff ratio, predominantly we're using 2020/21 academic year data, sometimes calculating a 2-year average for smaller areas of activity, so that 2019/20 data is also used. Spend per student data, we'd normally be using 2020/21 data at this point, but JISC released it really late, or HEIR did, I don't know which is which at the moment. But it was really late, we couldn't use it. So we're still using the exact same data as 2019/20 with no amendments or enhancements. Average entry tariff, I'll mention it again later, but we were very concerned that the 2020 data wouldn't be usable because of the effects of the pandemic. Actually, the differences weren't that great. So we used 2020 value-added scores. We used 2020/21 graduating cohort of students, looking at the extent to which they exceeded expectations of getting a first or 2-1. Career after 15 months, we used two data points in combination. We had 2018/19 and 2019/20. Now, this is a metric that we're always very careful about using across years. In fact, we had an explicit rule for many years that we would never do that. And that was because we got a bit burned in the recession of 2008, where we tried to average across 2 years, but the economic environment had deteriorated so much for the class of 2009 that it was really unfair for departments that had a bigger cohort in 1 year than the other. To be combining across years like that. So we've always had a rule never to do that. So this year we needed to, because the response rates aren't great, and we had 2 years of data that we wanted to use. So we've been quite careful. We've deliberately made this unweighted. So if you've got like 100 students in the 2019/20 cohort and only 20 students in the 18/19 cohort, we would be calculating the percentage who had good outcomes for each of those and just doing a straight average of those results. No acknowledgement that there was more in 1 year than the other. And that's because we were seeing the alleviating effects of the pandemic mean that 2018/19 results were more depressed than 19/20. And to take the years, to weight by the different responses in the different years would have had the potential to disadvantage an institution that had more respondents in 18/19 than they did in 19/20. Continuation is another tricky one because of the subject changes. We used 2018/19 and 2019/20 first years and looked at where they were a year later. So it's always 2 years for continuation and always has been. And it's always a kind of year in arrears because we have to wait to see what becomes of those first years a year later. Is that okay? Do you have any other questions about that?
No, that's fabulous. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Okay,
Matt,
so what?
Matt,
yeah.
Sorry, you've also got a question about publication date. Sorry, I don't know if you caught that one earlier.
No, it's not going to take place tomorrow. It's probably going to be 2 weeks according to the editor. I'm hearing this today. I don't know any of this for a fact, but I think that's the rough thing they're working to. So it was 8 years since
we've got another hand up.
Oh,
sorry,
right.
Matt.
Go for it.
Another hand up. Can't see who it is. Sorry, just come in, whoever that is.
Hi, Matt. I just wanted to ask you, thank you very much for identifying all of the sources for each measure. Can you just, apologies if I'm asking you this before you come to it, but can you just highlight the weighting, because there were changes in weighting last year for different measures because of pandemic effects and things?
Yep. The NSS results are now collectively 20%. They used to be 25%. We reduced it last year. So that goes 8, 8, 4. Student staff ratio 15%. Spend per student 5%. I think all of the remainder are 15%. Yeah. Each one of these is 15%, and it's slightly different from medical subjects because some of the data isn't really meaningful for medical subjects. We'd seen some subjects grow. 8 years ago, we noticed that criminology it became available through JAX codes. We noticed that it had grown within the broader subject of sociology, and so we introduced it in its own right, and it's flourished as a large subject that people are interested in. So we were really thinking about this year, you know, what else has emerged. Sociology is actually quite small once you've removed criminology, and it's getting smaller. So this year we were considering how to keep it going as a subject. It contracted to the extent that we actually amalgamated it with social policy, which was another small subject. So those were the sorts of things we were looking for, because things wax and wane over time. Also, as I mentioned before, the introduction of HEIR code offered new opportunities. There were subjects that were now visible in HEIR codes that had been non-visible in the JAX classification. Biomedical sciences being a good example of this. There wasn't a dedicated JAX code. It's an absolutely huge subject area. It easily stands alone. It's much bigger than some of the subjects we were producing before. So introducing that was a positive opportunity. And some subjects were just very small. You look at American studies here, which we discontinued. We were only getting 13 providers in a year, less than 1,500 students. Patchy coverage because they're small departments within those 13. So scores like career prospects, which depend on students getting to the end of the course and then responding to a survey 15 months later. So it's got one of the lowest coverages of all our metrics. That was frequently not available for subjects like American Study and Materials Engineering. So we wanted to look at all of these and make sure they could continue to stand on their own 2 feet. I've mentioned some of these. Career prospect data was available again. It was missing in last year's guide because 18-19 data didn't come out in time. So this year we used both 18-19 and 19-20. But as I said, expenditure data had gone AWOL. We changed the rule that was irritating some people about entry standards for departments in which the majority of entrants are mature. But then we had to replace it with extra conditions about the size of the cohort we were looking at, and we introduced entry bands for value-added scores that matched the continuation metrics approach to classifying students into bands with different expectations based on who they are and how they enter. So we made it more sophisticated. Unfortunately, at the very end of the process, JISC notified us that they hadn't properly discerned BTEC students. So that's an enhancement that has to wait till next year. It was too late to start from scratch with that metric. We didn't change the NSS weighting, having reduced it last year. We thought that would be temporary, but we kept it the same. We recommissioned data for 1920 according to the new subjects, because we thought we might have to chuck all the 2020-21 entry cohort in the bin because of the response to COVID and the teachers' assessment grades, but actually the difference wasn't so. The difference was tangible, but it wasn't so great as to invalidate. We did see the sort of advantage for top institutions, most selective institutions, kind of be eroded a bit by the broader increase in entry qualification. So there's a bit of disadvantage there, but it wasn't so much as to say we couldn't use the data. So those were the drivers for change. and that's the main reason we wanted to look at the subjects that we were producing guides for. So we started this exercise, and we knew that we had to find a balance between the following factors. The titles that we used needed to be meaningful to our target audience. If we just drove things completely from HEIR codes, we would get to places that that are easy to classify, but they might not be what the students themselves are talking about. An example is, I think it's biosciences, is a HEIR code and a CAR code, but actually if you look at what students are searching for, they never search for that term. They'll search for biology, pure and simple. Fenwick, do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, sorry to bother you again, Matt.
No, it's fine,
on your last slide,
Mm.
there was a big thing saying about the big changes in NSS for 2024.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, with things that are coming, can you allude to any insights that you might be dealing with, or is it all a bit in the dark at the minute?
It's all in the dark, I'm afraid. We have a review group. We'll be poring over this when we meet to debrief after this year's guide gets published. Don't know. I mean, it's been designed in such a way that there's not one constant scale for every question. So any type of aggregation is going to be contentious. I think, you know, it's going to be particularly difficult in that first year when we don't know what the results look like and how people are using it. It's an opportunity for some creativity as well. We don't know much about timing either. I mean, if this is going to take a while to design and implement, what will we do next year? We could just use the 2022 NSS results themselves by a year rather than aggregating across 2021 and 2022. So that's an easy contingency plan if we're either not getting new data or feel that we're not in a position to use what is becoming available.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks.
Cheers. Okay. Yeah, we want to be careful with what we called our subjects. We wanted to make sure that the scale was addressed. We want to be describing activity of a volume that supports stable rankings. As I mentioned earlier, a lack of stability is our enemy. We're always trying to smooth things out, harmonize across years, reduce crazy jumps that would detract from the credibility of the guide. Of course, the subjects that we produce have to be definable using the HEIR coding and indeed the cost sensors. And we want them to be enduring. We don't want to do this a subject review more frequently than every 5 years. Realistically, they have to last between 5 and 10 years. And ideally, we don't want to rock the boat too much either. We want to make them, you know, we don't want to change for change's sake. If the current subject boundaries work, we'll keep them. So timing, this all started about 18 months ago when we purchased the 2019-20 data at HEIR level for the whole sector. So we had everybody's data by HEIR code as soon as it was available. Very grateful to Unifrog, who a member of the review group was in contact with, who managed to acquire data on the terms that students search for and where they ultimately end up expressing their interest in, and that was invaluable in making sure we used the right terminology. Next, we produced a proposed subject suite late in 2021, and we consulted on that first with the review group, then with the Guardian, and then with our university contacts. We have 130 contacts at different institutions, so it was good to be able to show them what we were proposing to do and make sure no one sort of stood up and said, no, that's crazy, don't do that. We then received our new data for the new year from JISC, coded according to the subjects that we'd designed, and then we had to make a very fast go, no-go decision. There was always the risk that some subjects, you know, when we got the data back, they were going to come back with like 5 participants and you know, patchy data. So we had to very quickly process what we'd got without any of the normal verification procedures and look at how big each subject ranking was going to be, how big and how complete. We had to build lots of assumptions in that because we didn't have all the data available to us. So we had to make that decision and then produce a very early preview to the sector saying these are the departments that you're going to appear in, or what's missing, what's wrong. And thankfully we didn't get anyone come back saying you know, it's a nonsense what you've produced, or my major department is missing and the reasons for it being missing aren't good. Of course, there are always departments that are too small to appear in our rankings, but we didn't want it to be because of the way we classified subjects. Then we encountered extra challenges that we hadn't foreseen during the validation. Most things we did foresee, and we managed for it in the dates that we ordered. But there are additional things that we had to think about on the fly, and that was quite challenging. We had to use a lot more discretion than we normally like to. As much as possible, we try and make everything automated every year so that every institution is always treated the same. This year we had to negotiate and discuss a lot of things with different institutions to make sure that we were treating them fairly and not excluding from view legitimate departments that we want our prospective undergraduates to be able to see. So the approach we took, the review group had three options for thinking about how we were going to review the subjects. Three different approaches. Firstly, we could see the course titles that are predominant within larger subjects. Secondly, you can assess the demand for students. And thirdly, we can identify HEIR codes that are used extensively. And we needed to find a balance between these really. So there are several factors to be aware of. If you speak to academics about their subject area, they'll often tell you that it's a madness to group them together because they're very, very different. And the closer you are to a subject area, the more you understand the differences between them. So you can't take that too far. Otherwise, you try and produce a league table for pharmacy and for pharmacology and for pharmaceutical sciences, and all of them are too small. We wanted to be aware of trendy course titles that have peaked. They look like they're going somewhere, but they're not. And we wanted to look out for aggregated titles that in the HEIR codes that can't be allocated to a single Guardian subject group. There are certain HEIR doesn't have hierarchy in it anymore, so some of the subjects within it are absolutely huge. It's like anything in business and management, anything in art and design. We want to operate at a more granular level than that, so we don't want to just respond to those. We need to know when to stop drilling into the data. It was with the data sources we had available to us, it was possible to take things to a much deeper level than was necessary. But some of the questions were, well, you could drill into a subject like nursing, but if the provision is going to be very common across the different divisions of nursing, is it worth breaking it down? Because the prospective student might just get what they need just by looking at an overall nursing table, and telling them that child nursing and adult nursing and the other things might not be useful. We concluded it was in that particular example, but it was a question to ask. And you had to be aware that if you go too small, metrics will frequently be missing, and that detracts from the guide. So we looked at demand from students. So the UniFrog had quite a similar mission to the Guardian University Guide in that they're trying to help students find places in higher education that are right from them. They take a less metrics-driven approach to it, but they're still a technical company. They were kind enough to share some of their data with us on what students search for and what they find. So the way their model works is a prospective student will enter their own search term, like, for example, international development. Ultimately, on their journey, they'll select a course. So in this case, they might have selected something called international relations. That course can be linked back to a CAR 3 subject. In this case, it might be politics. So that would be creating an association between when a student searches for international development. If they end up in politics, that's a useful connection. So that student's particular journey creates an association that we could feed into our analysis of what subject titles we wanted to use and where we wanted to draw the lines. So there were two ways of taking this. On the one hand, we could see what search term students are using and what subjects are most likely to be relevant to that search term. But on the other, it also showed us for each subject which search terms are most commonly used to get the student there. So we had two pieces of information, and they supported both the introduction of new subjects, because if people are searching for something, it's expressing a need for something that's quite closely related to it and closely relevant. And it was also for the renaming of existing subjects as well. Going back to the example of biosciences, which has been a Guardian subject group title forever, and it refers to a CAR 3 code of the same name. Prospective students never search for biosciences, they'll just search for biology. So that's why we renamed that one. It was really interesting data to get hold of. We were very grateful to Unifroc, who didn't really ask for anything in return. But they were very kind of them. But then on the other hand, we had to balance up what students want to know about and what we can provide meaningful data for. So we had to be mindful of the HEIR codes. So because we'd acquired that full data for 2019-20, as soon as we had a proposal, in this example for a new subject of international relations, we could see how many students were in the HEIR codes that might be associated with that subject. We had to scramble this data because it's only released to us under a very strict license about not sharing it onwards in full detail. So we had to kind of scramble everything and round it to the nearest thing. So it still gave the sector the overall impression of scale and size and the number of departments, but not in such a way that revealed information that we weren't licensed to reveal. So that's quite a challenge. So coming together, it's that's pretty much how we balanced what students are looking for and what we could classify at a scale that would support meaningful and reliable statistics. So the subject changes themselves, we moved from 54 subjects to 66. 31 didn't change at all. 3 had their subjects changed, but didn't actually change their composition. 8 had minor touches to their composition. 7 subjects kind of remained the same, but had a major part taken out. So politics remained politics, but it no longer had international relations as part of it. 2 subjects were amalgamated and 2 were discontinued. That gave us space to introduce 16 new subjects. Here's an example of the sorts of transition that we shared out and showed people. So previously we had anatomy and physiology and health professions. Guess what? When you can see biomedical sciences within what was anatomy and physiology, there's not that much left of anatomy and physiology. So the question became, if you produce something from biomedical sciences, is there enough left here to produce a reliable ranking? We concluded there was in that case, but it was a question. Similarly with health professions like radiography are still in here. They weren't quite big enough to stand by themselves, but there were certain areas like paramedic science and physiotherapy that you could draw out, and they had substantial enough numbers at a substantial enough range of providers for a league table to be meaningful. Another big area that we changed was within design and crafts. We broke that out so that the areas that are more affiliated with engineering could stand out in product design, and then graphic design was big enough to stand on its own 2 feet. And there were a few other changes as well. We showed people things at the HEIR level too, so they could really see what mattered in each subject area and how things were changing. So we were very transparent in what we were proposing to do. We didn't get huge amounts of feedback, but I do feel we gave the sector assurance that we were making those changes with a lot of in a very informed way. So then we were able to show the consequences for subject coverage. So this is after the changes. You can see that subjects like history of art remain very small, but we decided to keep them in, and some subject areas remain absolutely enormous. And we provide this summary of changes as well, just to list what changed. There were some things that we foresaw. Our annual data order was complicated by the subject changes. We had to order the grad outcomes data for 1819 according to the old JAX code rather than HEIR code, because it was so old that it was classified like that. We also had, well, we tried to retain continuity where there was some. So even a subject like politics that had lost international relations, we maintained the connection to the previous year, so that if a department was slightly too small, it could still draw on the previous year. But again, this wasn't ideal. You know, the classifications had changed between years, but we were allowing 2-year averages to be exceptionally used. So again, rather than that just being an automatic process, we had to give it a lot of extra manual scrutiny. We missed it for amalgamated subjects as well. There were cases like sociology and social policy, where the new amalgamation wasn't connected to either of the sort of members that had made it up. So again, we had to manually intervene upon negotiating with individual departments. And we had to create amalgamated cost centres as well, which presented a technical challenge and wasn't completely foreseen. For the continuation metric, we wanted to use 2-year averages, but of course the prior year data was a higher grain than the data for the current year. So again, a bit of a fudge factor there that we try to avoid. In general, our validation processes they depend heavily on checking year-to-year consistency. So the subject discontinuity provided a massive challenge to how we check things year on year. Attention was naturally being directed to discrepancies in the subjects that hadn't changed, and we had to make sure that we were doing extra manual checks on the new subject, so that they weren't being omitted. It was a challenging year, but it was carefully planned, and although we had to use more discretion than normal when negotiating data mappings and transferals of data, it seems to have worked out well. We expected the change in subjects to really shake things up, but we were quite pleasantly surprised to see a great deal of consistency. Overall, things have stayed pretty much the same, apart from the majorly exciting headline story that you'll have to buy The Guardian to see whenever it comes out. So that's the end of my presentation. Happy to take all sorts of questions. Thanks.
You've got hi Matt, sorry, you've got a question from Ibrahim about subject composition tableau dashboard.
Okay.
It's not available, is it?
I think I'll get a link. There it is. Okay. Thanks, Kirsty. Yeah, I like sharing. Are there any other questions about anything that we're planning on doing this year? Bearing in mind that I can't actually tell you about how things are going to end up. And are there any follow-on questions from Paul Ashwin's session earlier about trying to measure quality and performance in higher education, and the extent to what that being what we're trying to do, as opposed to looking at suitability of students?
I think you've got a hand up, Matt Fennick.
Oh yeah.
Got another question.
You'll be sick of this sound of my voice. Sorry about that. Matt, would it be possible for to get a copy of the slides?
Yeah, sure.
That would be great.
I'll create a sharing link.
Great stuff. Absolutely superb presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
Just going back through the chat, Matt, and see if there was one about the SSR. Did you?
I think I answered that at the time.
I think I was going to say, I think you went through that one.
Ah, yes. Okay, good question from Andrew here about the NSS gaps from Oxford and Cambridge. I'm really pleased you asked this, because it's something, accused might be a strong word, but we get accused of it all the time, and we don't do anything different for them. I know. I kind of agree with Paul. It is damaging that our top two, well, the institutions that are often in the top three, or always in the top three, don't have NSS results, and they kind of escape that scrutiny that others do, and yet we still say that they're among the best. We don't treat any of them differently in the methodology. We have a substitution process that looks at the weighting of each metric and allows a tolerance whereby up to 40% worth of metrics can be missing in a subject before we say no, we just don't have enough information to make a reliable comparison between you and other providers of the subject. And that's true for Oxford and Cambridge. They're not being treated any differently because the NSS results are worth a collective 20% and previously 25%. But those institutions tend to either not do a subject at all or do it at scale. And so it's quite rare that they're missing other metrics. So you can take the 20% or 25% worth of NSS results out of every department, and they still have enough other information to support a ranked position. We use a substitution process for any department when data is missing. It first refers to any prior year results, or for the NSS of those subjects there are none. It then asks whether the missing metric is correlated to the other metrics. If it is, then we assume that the department would have performed as well in the missing metric as they do in the other metrics that are present. So Oxford and Cambridge might get quite a favourable assumption if there is that correlation, because we'd be saying, effectively that the students would be as satisfied as they are benefited by expenditure, student staff ratios, good degree outcomes, and positive graduate prospects, and so on. But equally, if there's no correlation, we just assume the sector mean, and there's no benefit there whatsoever. So we do treat them exactly the same as everybody else. It does make some of the comparisons at the top a little bit tricky, especially when you're trying to explain why one institution has bettered another when a major piece of information is missing.
Hi, Matt. This is Andrew. Thank you for answering that question so clearly. Out of interest, what measures do correlate with NSS?
We do it subject by subject.
Okay.
So it depends within each. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt.
Cheers. Well, we've got 4 minutes left. I'm happy to take any questions. I know this has been dampened a bit by the news today, and so well, yesterday. So probably a bit less participation. Oh, there is one question. Did the number of institutions ranked across subjects decrease significantly? No, we got more departments in total, but I don't know. I'd have to go through individually. Overall, the number of departments increased because it was more likely for a provider who was present in one subject before to then be present in both sides of that subject when it was split. So it's more likely that, say, Kingston was offering politics and international relationships, and that used to count as one subject, and now it counts as 2, than it was the other way around, where Kingston provided politics and international relations, but when you've split them out, both are so small that they appear in neither. So it's only in that second scenario that you see the downside, and in a lot of cases there's the upside. So overall, the number of departments increased across the 66 subjects. Would I prefer not to have an institutional table? I kind of like it. I enjoy it. I'm just aware that it is moving more towards the things that Paul doesn't like. It's a kind of proxy for performance and quality, and I think the justification is a bit weaker for those, whereas I feel very secure in what we do at a subject level, and I think we're doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah, thank you. It's Andrew again. I asked because when in the methodology that's published on The Guardian, it is kind of downplayed. These are just averages, and it feels like it's something that, you know, you perhaps wouldn't like to exist. But maybe I'm just reading too much.
No, you're right. I mean, I've got less confidence in my justifications. I think it does a good job of attracting attention to the guide overall by making the headline splash that always looks at the institutional level, and then that funnels students towards using the subject level guide, which is what I want them actually to be using. So it serves that purpose, and therefore I'm fully behind it.
Fair enough. Thank you, Matt.
Cheers.
Matt, can I just ask a question? We've got 1 minute left. I was just wondering about new indicators and what the Guardian's thinking were about any kind of exploring any new indicators, any sort of alignment with new B3 metrics or TEF metrics that the OFS are publishing. Just, yeah, thoughts on that.
Good question. I'll be thinking out the box here. I mean, it's the NSS is something's going to happen to the NSS. Without it, we'll have to think carefully about what else is available to approximate teaching quality. So we'll have to be creative. I mean, before I got involved with the Guardian University Guide, there were a few years where the TQAs were sort of old to the point of expiration, and the NSS hadn't come in yet, and the metrics that we used to fill that gap took a lot of criticism from the sector. It's actually how I got involved with this whole gig. So need to avoid that, but we'd have to do something. I think we've got at least 1 year's grace based on what we've got with the NSS. But beyond that, we'd have to think, and we might produce something that people don't like so much. Other innovations I've seen recently, I thought it was good of the Complete University Guide to use that assessment of whether graduates feel they're on track with their studies. I think there are other things within the Graduate Outcome Survey that we could use, not just purely about what are you doing and are you getting well paid, but more about, you know, now you've had the time to think about what your experience was. Now do you think you got what you need? And that again, you know, Mary Cook's talk yesterday really resonated with me when she was talking about the skills that people acquire. Maybe, you know, could we extract something from the Graduate Outcome Survey that asks, you know, did you pick up the soft skills, the graduate attributes, as Gerald mentioned earlier? Did you get all of that you needed to take your first steps? And I think that would be a nice place to go to. We'd have to worry about the technicalities, of course. Leo data, the Guardian never really wanted to touch. It would have been tricky data to use, but you know, that's an option, but not an option that I think has any support from anyone really. I don't know. I think that's it. I suppose there was the TEF metric on the compound metric for degree completion. Too complicated to explain was my view, but I can see the way it tried to square the circle of, you don't want to just think about first years, you want to think about the whole student life cycle. You know, you want students to finish their qualifications, but you don't want to wait 5 years to measure it. So there was merit in that, but I won't be rushing to adopt it.
Right, thank you. Anyone got any last final questions? We're 2 minutes over our time, but can't see any other hands up.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matt. I think people have really appreciated the access to you and your freedom of answering all those questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for attending. And I'll be in correspondence with you in future if you need to talk about league tables ever. It is my favourite topic. Okay, I'm going to go then. Much. That's the end.
The end. Thanks all. Thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.